The bullet grazed past Danielle Lawson's ear so close she could feel the heat of it. And in that moment of terror, a strong arm wrapped around her waist and yanked her behind the safety of a water trough, as 3 more shots rang out across the dusty main street of Fort Bridger, Wyoming territory. It was August of 1878, and Danielle had only been in the frontier town for 2 weeks, having traveled from her family's farm in Missouri after her parents passed from fever. At 17 years old, she found herself orphaned and alone, sent to live with her uncle who ran the general store. The West was wilder than anything she had imagined, and now she was learning exactly how dangerous it could be when outlaws decided to shoot up the town looking for the sheriff, who had arrested one of their gang. The man who had saved her was pressed against her back, his body shielding hers as more gunfire erupted. She could feel his heart beating steadily despite the chaos, could smell leather and sage and something distinctly masculine. When the shooting finally stopped and voices shouted that the bandits had fled, he slowly released her and stood, offering his hand to help her up. Danielle looked up into the bluest eyes she had ever seen, set in a face that was sun-bronzed and handsome beneath the wide brim of a dusty hat. He appeared to be in his early 20s, tall and lean with the build of someone who spent long hours in the saddle. A silver badge was pinned to his vest, catching the afternoon sunlight. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice a deep drawl that seemed to wrap around her like warm honey. She nodded mutely, suddenly aware that her legs were shaking and her dress was soaked from the water that had splashed over the edge of the trough. He steadied her with gentle hands on her shoulders, his touch careful and respectful. "That was quite an introduction to Fort Bridger," she managed to say, trying to smile despite her racing heart. "Xavier Young, Deputy Marshal," he introduced himself, removing his hat briefly to reveal dark hair that fell across his forehead. "And I apologize on behalf of the town. Usually, we try to keep the welcoming committee from shooting at new arrivals." Despite everything, Danielle found herself laughing, a slightly hysterical edge to it. He smiled in response, and she felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the danger she had just escaped. "Danielle Lawson," she replied. "I'm staying with my uncle at the general store. I arrived from Missouri 2 weeks ago." Xavier's expression softened with understanding. "I heard about that. I'm sorry for your loss. Your uncle mentioned his niece was coming to stay with him." Before she could respond, an older man with a marshal's badge came striding up, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Lawson, are you hurt? Xavier, did you see which way they rode?" "She's fine, Marshal Porter. They headed north toward the creek." "I'm going after them now," Xavier said, but his eyes remained on Danielle as if making sure she truly was unharmed. "Go on then and take Deputy Collins with you. Miss Lawson, let me escort you back to your uncle's store. I'm sure he's worried sick." Danielle allowed Marshal Porter to guide her down the street, but she found herself looking back over her shoulder at Xavier Young as he swung up onto a beautiful paint horse and cantered out of town with another deputy at his side. Something about the way he had protected her, the gentle concern in his eyes, had struck something deep within her that she had never felt before. Her Uncle Herbert was indeed frantic when she arrived, pulling her into a tight embrace despite the fact that he was usually a reserved man. "Thank God you're safe. I heard the shooting and feared the worst. You shouldn't have been out walking alone." "I was only going to the seamstress shop like you asked," Danielle protested gently. "How was I to know outlaws would come riding through?" Herbert shook his head, his thin face drawn with worry. He was her mother's older brother, a bachelor in his 50s who had never expected to become guardian to a teenage niece. "Things are different out here, Danielle, more dangerous. You need to be more careful." Over the following days, Danielle found herself thinking about Xavier Young more than she probably should have. She learned from town gossip, shared by the customers who came through the general store, that he was 23 years old and had been a deputy marshal for 2 years. He was well respected, known for his quick draw and his fair judgment. Several of the young ladies in town had set their caps for him, but he remained politely distant from all romantic entanglements, focused on his work. She saw him occasionally as he made his rounds through town, always tipping his hat to her with that slight smile that made her heart skip. Sometimes he would stop into the general store for supplies, and they would exchange brief pleasantries. Each time, Danielle felt that same flutter of attraction, that pull toward him that seemed to grow stronger with every encounter. It was 3 weeks after the shooting incident when Xavier came into the store on a quiet afternoon. Danielle was alone, her uncle having gone to meet with a supplier. She was arranging canned goods on a high shelf, standing on a stepladder that wobbled precariously. "Careful there," Xavier said, and suddenly he was beside her, one hand steadying the ladder and the other hovering near her waist in case she fell. "That ladder's seen better days." "Everything in this store has seen better days," Danielle replied, but she carefully climbed down, very aware of his proximity. "Uncle Herbert says he cannot afford to replace things until business improves. How are you settling into Fort Bridger?" Xavier asked, leaning against the counter with an easy grace. Today he wore a dark blue shirt that made his eyes even more striking, and Danielle had to remind herself not to stare. "It's quite different from home," she admitted, "but I'm adjusting." "Uncle Herbert is kind, even if he doesn't quite know what to do with a niece underfoot." "I imagine it's an adjustment for both of you," Xavier said. "Though I have to say, you've brought some brightness to this dusty town." Danielle felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "That's kind of you to say, Deputy Young." "Xavier," he corrected gently. "When I'm not actively chasing outlaws, I'd prefer you call me Xavier. Then you must call me Danielle." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing easily between them. Xavier told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, how he had come to law enforcement after his father died, and the ranch had to be sold. Danielle shared stories of Missouri, of the farm her family had worked, of her mother's flower garden and her father's terrible singing voice that had nevertheless filled their home with joy. When Herbert returned, Xavier purchased some tobacco and coffee, tipped his hat to them both, and left. Herbert gave Danielle a long, considering look, but said nothing. Over the next several months, Xavier found more and more reasons to stop by the general store. Sometimes it was for legitimate supplies, but often it was just to talk to Danielle, to hear her laugh, to watch the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about something that interested her. She had a quick mind and a kind heart, and he found himself falling for her a little more each day. The problem was her age. Xavier had been very aware from the beginning that Danielle was only 17. He was 23, which was not a scandalous age difference by frontier standards, but the maturity gap felt significant to him. More importantly, she had just lost her parents, had been uprooted from everything familiar, and was still finding her footing in this new life. The last thing she needed was a lawman pressing his romantic attentions on her when she was vulnerable. So Xavier kept his feelings locked away, treating her with careful friendship and nothing more, even as his heart ached every time she smiled at him. Danielle, for her part, was not oblivious to her own growing feelings. Xavier occupied her thoughts constantly. She found herself looking forward to his visits, choosing her dresses more carefully on the days she thought he might come by, staying alert for the sound of his boots on the wooden sidewalk outside. She wrote about him in the journal she kept hidden under her pillow, pouring out feelings she could not voice aloud. But she was also intelligent enough to know that at 17, recently orphaned and still grieving, she was in a vulnerable position. She did not want Xavier to see her as a child, but she also knew that she was young, still figuring out who she was in this new place. The situation came to a head one evening in late October. The weather had turned cold, and the first snow was threatening. Danielle had stayed late at the store, helping Herbert with inventory, and was walking back to their small house behind the main building when 3 drunk men stumbled out of the saloon directly into her path. "Well, what have we here?" one of them slurred, blocking her way. "Pretty little thing out all alone." Danielle's heart jumped into her throat. She tried to step around them, but they moved with her, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I need to get home." "What's your hurry?" another one said, reaching out to touch her arm. "Stay and talk with us a while." "The lady said she needs to get home." Xavier's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. He materialized from the shadows, his hand resting on his gun belt in a casual but unmistakable threat. "And you boys are going to let her pass." The drunk men took one look at the Deputy Marshal's badge and the steely determination in Xavier's eyes and scattered like leaves in the wind. Danielle sagged with relief, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." "I make it a point to keep an eye out when you're working late," Xavier admitted. "It's not safe for you to walk alone after dark." Something in his tone, the raw concern and something deeper, something warmer, made Danielle bold. "Why do you watch out for me specifically, Xavier?" He looked at her for a long moment, the moonlight casting shadows across his face. "You know why, Danielle," her breath caught. "Do I?" Xavier took a step closer, then seemed to catch himself and stopped. "You're young. You've been through a lot. The last thing you need is a lawman who's twice as likely to end up dead in a gunfight as make it to old age, making things complicated for you." "I'm not as young as you think," Danielle said, moving closer to him. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I feel things, Xavier." "I know what I want, Danielle." His voice was strained. "I think about you constantly," she confessed, throwing caution to the wind. "I look forward to every visit, every conversation. I care about you, Xavier Young, and I think you care about me too." Xavier closed his eyes briefly, clearly warring with himself. When he opened them, they were filled with tenderness and longing. "Of course I care about you. I've been half in love with you since the day I pulled you behind that water trough. But Danielle, you're 17. You've lost your parents. You're in a new place and you're still figuring out your life. I won't take advantage of that. I won't take advantage of you." "You wouldn't be taking advantage," Danielle protested, her voice rising with emotion. "I know my own heart." Xavier reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with infinite care. "I believe you do, but you deserve time to be sure. Time to grieve properly, to settle into your life here, to grow into the woman you're meant to be without the pressure of a relationship clouding everything." "So what are you saying?" Danielle asked, tears pricking her eyes. "That we can never be together?" "No," Xavier said firmly, his hand still cradling her face. "I'm saying that I'll wait, however long it takes. When you're older, when you've had time to be certain, when you're truly ready, I'll be here. I'll wait for you, Danielle Lawson, because you're worth waiting for." Danielle felt tears slip down her cheeks. "But I'm too young," she said, the words both a protest and an acknowledgement. "Is that what you're telling me?" "Right now, yes," Xavier said gently. "But that's a problem that time solves. I'm not going anywhere. When you're ready, truly ready, I'll be here. I promise you that." He leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, lingering for just a moment, and then stepped back. "Come on, let me walk you home properly." They walked in silence to her uncle's house, and Danielle felt a strange mixture of heartbreak and hope. Xavier was right, even if she did not want to admit it. She was young, she was still grieving, and she was still finding her place in Fort Bridger. But knowing that he cared for her, that he would wait for her, filled her with a warmth that pushed back against the cold October night. At her door, Xavier tipped his hat. "Good night, Danielle." "Good night, Xavier." The next months were both difficult and oddly peaceful. Xavier continued to visit the store, but there was a new understanding between them. They talked as friends, but beneath every conversation was the promise he had made, the future he had offered. Danielle threw herself into helping her uncle with the store, into making friends with the other young women in town, into establishing her own identity separate from her grief and her attraction to Xavier. She turned 18 in February of 1879, and Xavier brought her a gift, a beautiful leather-bound book for her journal writing. "Happy birthday," he said simply, and she saw in his eyes that he remembered the promise, but he was going to let her set the pace. Spring came to Wyoming territory, and with it came renewed trouble. A gang of rustlers had been hitting the ranches outside Fort Bridger, and Xavier and the other lawmen were spending long days and nights tracking them down. Danielle found herself worried constantly, scanning the horizon whenever Xavier was out on patrol, breathing easier only when she saw him ride back into town. It was during this time that Danielle truly understood what it meant to care for someone who lived a dangerous life. Every time Xavier left town, she faced the possibility that he might not come back. It would have been easier to protect her heart, to step back from her feelings, but she found she could not. If anything, the danger made her more certain of what she wanted. In May, the rustlers were finally caught after a tense standoff at an abandoned homestead north of town. Xavier took a bullet to the shoulder during the confrontation, and when Danielle heard, she abandoned the store midday and ran to the doctor's office where they had taken him. The doctor was just finishing bandaging Xavier's wound when she burst through the door, her face pale and frightened. Xavier looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Danielle, I'm fine," he said quickly. "It's just a scratch," she said, her voice shaking. "You were shot." The doctor, a grizzled man named Patterson, chuckled. "Young lady, I assure you Deputy Young will make a full recovery. The bullet went clean through and missed anything important. He'll be sore for a few weeks, but he'll live." Danielle sank into a chair, suddenly aware that she was making a scene. Xavier watched her with an expression she could not quite read, and after Dr. Patterson finished and left them alone, he spoke quietly. "You were worried about me." "Of course I was worried," Danielle said fiercely. "Do you think I can just turn off my feelings because you decided we should wait?" Xavier smiled, though there was pain in it, whether from his wound or from the emotion of the moment she could not tell. "No, I suppose not. I can't turn mine off either." "How long?" Danielle asked, moving to kneel beside his chair. "How long do I have to wait before you'll believe I'm ready?" Xavier reached out with his good arm and took her hand. "I don't have a set time, Danielle. I just want you to be sure. You're 18 now, you're not a child. But I need to know that when we start this, when we take this step, it's because you've had time to really think about what you want. Not just about your feelings for me, but about the life that comes with those feelings. Being with a lawman means sleepless nights worrying, means facing the possibility of loss. I need to know you've chosen that with your eyes wide open." Danielle squeezed his hand. "I've been thinking about nothing else for months, Xavier. Every day you ride out, I worry. Every night you're late coming back, I imagine the worst. And every time I see you again, I'm grateful. I know exactly what I would be choosing." "And what about you?" Xavier pressed. "What do you want for yourself beyond me? What are your dreams, Danielle?" She sat back, considering the question seriously. I want to build a life here. I want to expand Uncle Herbert's store, maybe add a lending library section since the town doesn't have a proper library. I want to help build this community, make it a better place. And yes, I want a family someday, children, a home, but I want all of that with you, Xavier. You're part of those dreams now. Xavier studied her face for a long moment, and she met his gaze steadily, letting him see the truth in her eyes. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said softly. "All right, Danielle. If you're sure, then I'm done waiting." "I'm sure," she said firmly. He pulled her closer with his good arm, and this time when he kissed her, it was not on the forehead but on her lips, gentle and sweet and full of months of restrained longing. Danielle felt like her heart might burst from her chest, like every moment of waiting had been worth it to arrive at this perfect instant. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Danielle Lawson. I have for longer than I probably should admit." "I love you too," she whispered back. "I think I have since the day you pulled me behind that water trough." They courted properly after that, though everyone in Fort Bridger had known for months which way the wind was blowing between the deputy marshal and the general store girl. Xavier took her on chaperone picnics, walked her home from church on Sundays, and sat on the porch of her uncle's house in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing while Herbert watched from inside with approval. Herbert, for his part, was pleased with the match. Xavier was a good man, honest and hardworking, and he clearly adored Danielle. More importantly, he had been patient and respectful, waiting until she was truly ready rather than rushing her into anything. That showed character, in Herbert's opinion. The town ladies organized a barn dance in June, and Xavier asked Danielle to accompany him. She wore her best dress, a light blue cotton with white trim that she and the seamstress had worked on for weeks. When Xavier arrived to collect her, the look in his eyes made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the territory. They danced every dance together, scandalizing some of the older matrons but delighting the younger folks. Xavier was surprisingly graceful for such a tall man, and he held her like she was something precious. Between dances, they stood outside in the warm evening air, watching the stars emerge overhead. "You ever regret leaving Colorado?" Danielle asked, leaning against the barn wall while Xavier stood close, one hand braced on the wall beside her head. "Not anymore," he said. "Coming to Wyoming brought me to you. That makes every difficulty worth it. You have a way with words, Xavier Young." "Only when it comes to you," he replied, and kissed her again, deeper this time, until they were both flushed and breathless and had to return to the dance before rumors started that couldn't be quelled. In August, exactly 1 year after Danielle had arrived in Fort Bridger, Xavier proposed. He took her on a ride out to a meadow filled with wildflowers, spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree, and pulled out a small wooden box. "I'm not a rich man," he began, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. "But I'm a man who loves you with everything he has. I'm a man who wants to build a life with you, to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I'm a man who wants to face whatever comes with you by my side. Danielle Lawson, will you marry me?" Danielle was crying too hard to speak at first, but she nodded vigorously, holding out her left hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes," she finally managed to say. "Yes, Xavier, I'll marry you." He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, they kissed beneath the cottonwood tree, and Danielle felt like her happiness was complete. They were married in October of 1879, in the small church in Fort Bridger. It was a simple ceremony, but the whole town turned out to celebrate. Danielle wore a white dress that the ladies of the town had helped her sew, with lace collar and cuffs that had belonged to Xavier's mother, which he had saved for years. Herbert walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and Xavier waited at the altar looking handsome in a new black suit, his eyes never leaving hers. Marshal Porter performed the ceremony, as he was also an ordained minister. When he pronounced them husband and wife and Xavier kissed her, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The reception was held in the town hall, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Xavier had managed to rent a small house on the edge of town, and he carried Danielle over the threshold as was proper, then set her down gently in the parlor of what was now their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Young," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's perfect," Danielle said, looking around at the modest but clean rooms. They had furnished it simply with pieces bought from various townspeople or made by Xavier himself. "It's absolutely perfect." That night, they began their life together as husband and wife, and Danielle fell asleep in Xavier's arms feeling safer and more loved than she had since her parents died. She had found not just a new home in Fort Bridger, but a new family, a new purpose, and a love that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The first year of their marriage was an adjustment, as all first years are. Xavier's work kept him busy and often away, and there were nights when Danielle lay awake worrying about him, praying for his safe return. But there were also beautiful moments of domestic peace. Quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings working on their garden together, Sundays spent with friends and neighbors. Danielle continued to help Herbert at the store and slowly began implementing some of her ideas for improvement. With Xavier's encouragement and Herbert's blessing, she ordered in books and began setting up a small lending library in one corner of the general store. It became popular quickly, with folks coming from miles around to borrow books that they otherwise would never have access to. In the spring of 1880, Danielle discovered she was pregnant. Xavier was overjoyed, though he immediately became even more protective than before. Dr. Patterson assured them both that Danielle was healthy and strong, and that he expected no complications. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, though the heat made Danielle uncomfortable and Xavier fussed over her constantly. She found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating, but she loved him for his concern. Their son was born in December of 1880, during a snowstorm that nearly prevented Dr. Patterson from reaching their house in time. It was a long labor, and Xavier paced the parlor frantically while Herbert tried to calm him. When the baby's first cry finally rang out, Xavier burst into the bedroom to find Danielle exhausted but glowing, holding a squalling bundle in her arms. "It's a boy," she said, smiling up at him. "We have a son, Xavier." Xavier knelt beside the bed, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger, his eyes bright with tears. "He's perfect. You're perfect. Thank you, Danielle." They named him Samuel Herbert Young after Danielle's father and her uncle. Samuel was a healthy, loud baby who quickly became the center of their world. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to help with the baby when he was home, holding Samuel for hours just watching him sleep, singing off key lullabies that made Danielle laugh. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Danielle reduced her hours at the store, though she still managed the lending library section. Herbert, now a proud honorary grandfather, spent hours with baby Samuel, telling him stories and making silly faces to earn infant smiles. Xavier continued his work as a deputy marshal, but he began to think more about the future. He was now 25 years old with a wife and child depending on him. The risks he took, the dangers he faced, felt different now. It was one thing to risk his own life, It was another to risk leaving Danielle a widow and Samuel fatherless. In the fall of 1881, Marshal Porter announced his intention to retire. He was nearing 60 and wanted to spend his remaining years peacefully with his own wife. He recommended Xavier as his replacement, and the territorial governor agreed. Xavier Young became the marshal of Fort Bridger at 26 years old. The promotion came with a better salary and slightly less time in the saddle chasing outlaws. Xavier still faced danger, but as marshal, he had more authority to delegate the most dangerous tasks. It was a good balance, and Danielle felt easier knowing that while his work was still risky, it was perhaps slightly less so than before. In 1882, Danielle became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect and managed the pregnancy with more confidence. Their daughter, Rosemarie Young, was born in August, a small but fierce baby with Xavier's blue eyes and Danielle's dark hair. Samuel, now nearly 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, though his help usually created more work than it saved. The Young family continued to thrive. Xavier proved to be an excellent marshal, fair but firm, respected by both the townspeople and the outlaws he occasionally had to arrest. The crime rate in Fort Bridger actually decreased under his watch, partly because of his reputation and partly because of his skill at diffusing situations before they escalated into violence. Danielle's lending library grew so popular that the town council voted to allocate funds for a proper library building. Danielle was asked to serve as the head librarian, and she accepted with joy. The library opened in 1884, a small but well-stocked building right on Main Street. It became a gathering place for the community, offering not just books but also reading groups, children's story hours, and adult education classes. By 1885, Fort Bridger had grown from a rough frontier town into a more established community. The railroad had come through, bringing more settlers and more prosperity. Schools were improved, churches expanded, and businesses flourished. Xavier and Danielle felt proud to have been part of that growth, to have contributed to building something lasting. Their family expanded one final time in 1886 with the birth of another son, James Xavier Young. Danielle declared herself done with childbearing after that, and Xavier agreed they had been blessed enough with 3 healthy children. Samuel was now 5 and preparing to start school. Rose was 3 and already showing signs of having her mother's quick mind and her father's stubborn determination. And baby James was a placid, happy infant who rarely cried. Uncle Herbert, now in his 60s, finally agreed to take on an apprentice to help run the general store. His health was not what it had been, and he knew it was time to slow down. The young man he hired, a recent immigrant from Germany named Hans Becker, proved to be both hardworking and honest, and Herbert began teaching him the business with the intention of eventually selling the store to him. Life was good, peaceful in a way that seemed almost miraculous given the wildness of the territory just a few years earlier. Xavier and Danielle often sat on their porch in the evenings after the children were asleep and marveled at how far they had come. "Do you remember that day when you told me you would wait?" Danielle asked one such evening, holding Xavier's hand as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I remember every moment of falling in love with you," Xavier replied. "That was one of the hardest things I ever had to say, telling you we needed to wait. I wanted you so badly, but I knew it was the right thing to do." "It was," Danielle agreed. "I was so young, even if I didn't feel like it at the time. You gave me the gift of time to grow up, to be sure." "That's one of the reasons I love you so much, Xavier. You've always respected me, always treated me as an equal even when I was just a grieving girl who didn't know what she wanted." "You always knew what you wanted," Xavier countered. "You just needed time to be ready for it. And I would have waited forever if that's what it took." "Thankfully, it didn't require forever," Danielle said with a smile. "Just long enough." They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, and in the house behind them, they could hear Samuel and Rose playing together before bedtime, James cooing in his cradle. It was a life full of love and noise and joy, everything Danielle had dreamed of and more. In 1888, Marshal Porter passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 65. The whole town mourned him, and Xavier gave the eulogy at his funeral, speaking of the man who had mentored him, who had taught him not just how to enforce the law but how to serve the community with integrity. Danielle held his hand through it all, knowing how much Porter had meant to him. The years continued to pass in that way, marked by both joys and sorrows. Uncle Herbert died in 1891, having lived to see his beloved niece happily settled with a family of her own. He left the store to Hans Becker as planned, but also left a substantial sum to Danielle, money he had saved over the years specifically for her and her children. Samuel grew into a thoughtful, serious boy who loved books as much as his mother did. Rose was wild and adventurous, constantly climbing trees and getting into scrapes that gave her parents gray hairs. James was steady and reliable, even as a young child, already showing signs of his father's calm authority. Danielle continued her work at the library, which had expanded twice to accommodate its growing collection. She wrote articles for the territorial newspaper about education and literacy, and became something of a minor celebrity in Wyoming for her advocacy work. Xavier supported her ambitions fully, proud of everything she accomplished. In 1895, when Samuel was 14 and talking about becoming a lawyer, when Rose was 12 and already the best shot with a rifle in the county much to her father's mixed pride and concern, when James was 8 and following Xavier around like a shadow, Danielle and Xavier celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary. They took a trip to Denver, leaving the children with a trusted family friend, and spent 3 days just being Xavier and Danielle, not parents or marshal and librarian, but simply two people who had fallen in love 17 years earlier and had never fallen out of it. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked one night in their hotel room. "If you had gone somewhere else instead of Fort Bridger, you might have had an easier life, a safer life." Danielle cupped his face in her hands. "I have never regretted a single moment, Xavier Young. You gave me time when I needed it, love when I was ready for it, and a life beyond anything I could have imagined. How could I ever regret that?" "I just want you to be happy," he said simply. "I am happy. Incredibly, completely happy. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They made love that night with the passion of newlyweds and the tenderness of longtime partners who knew each other completely. When they returned to Fort Bridger, it was with renewed appreciation for both their life together and their family. Xavier served as Marshal of Fort Bridger for 25 years total, before finally retiring in 1906 at the age of 51. The territory had become a state in 1890, and Fort Bridger had grown from a frontier town into a proper city. Crime was minimal, the railroad brought prosperity, and there was less and less need for a marshal who was quick on the draw. Xavier's skills lay more in administration and leadership now, and when he announced his retirement, the city council threw a celebration in his honor. Danielle, at 46, also retired from the library, though she continued to volunteer there regularly. They bought a ranch outside of town, nothing huge, just enough land for some horses and cattle, a place where they could watch sunsets and enjoy the peace they had earned. Samuel had indeed become a lawyer and was practicing in Cheyenne, married to a lovely woman named Catherine with 2 children of their own. Rose had surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, channeling her fierce energy into educating the next generation, though she still rode horses faster than anyone else in the county. She was engaged to a rancher named Tom Patterson, the grandson of old Dr. Patterson. James had followed his father into law enforcement and was a deputy marshal in Laramie, earning a reputation for fairness and integrity just like his father. Xavier and Danielle's life together continued peacefully on their ranch. They hosted family dinners every Sunday when everyone could make it, their home filled with children and grandchildren and laughter. They took walks in the evenings, holding hands like youngsters, talking about everything and nothing. They read books together, Danielle often reading aloud while Xavier whittled or mended tack. They made love with the comfortable passion of people who had shared a bed for decades and still found joy in each other. In 1910, they celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary. Danielle was 50, Xavier was 55, and they were both healthy and active. They sat on the porch of their ranch house, much like they had sat on the porch of their first little house in town, watching the sunset. "I was thinking today about that girl you pulled behind a water trough," Xavier said thoughtfully. "She was so young, so scared, but so brave even in that fear. I knew right then I was in trouble." "And I was thinking about that cowboy who saved me," Danielle replied with a smile. "How he looked at me like I was precious, even though I was just a dusty, scared girl he had never met before. I think I fell in love with you in that moment, even though I didn't know it yet. And when I told you I would wait, I wanted to argue," Danielle admitted. "I wanted to insist I was old enough, mature enough, ready enough. But deep down, I knew you were right. I needed time, and you loved me enough to give me that time even when it must have been hard for you." "It was the hardest thing I have ever done," Xavier said. "But also the easiest, because I knew you were worth it. You have always been worth everything, Danielle." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Behind them, through the open window, they could hear Rose and Tom's children playing in the parlor, staying for the weekend. The sound of children's laughter had filled their home for decades now, and it never got old. "We built a good life," Danielle said softly. "We built a great life," Xavier corrected. "Not because it was easy, but because we built it together." As the stars began to emerge overhead, Xavier and Danielle went inside to help Rose get the children ready for bed. Later, they would sit by the fireplace with Rose and Tom, talking about the ranch and the school and the way the world was changing. But for now, there were grandchildren to tuck in, stories to read and kisses to give. That night, as Danielle lay in Xavier's arms in the bed they had shared for more than 3 decades, she thought about the scared 17-year-old girl she had been when she arrived in Fort Bridger. She thought about the young deputy marshal who had saved her life and then given her the time she needed to be ready for love. She thought about all the years in between, the struggles and the triumphs, the children and grandchildren, the life they had built brick by brick, moment by moment. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Xavier whispered back, his arms tightening around her. "Always have, always will." And as they drifted off to sleep, Danielle smiled, thinking that this was what happy endings looked like. Not perfect, not without challenges or sorrows, but full of love that had been tested and proven true. Love that had waited when waiting was needed, that had endured through danger and difficulty, that had grown stronger with every passing year. The Wild West had been tamed. Fort Bridger had grown from frontier town to proper city. And Danielle and Xavier had grown from young people finding their way to a couple with decades of shared history. But the love between them remained as fresh and vital as it had been that day, when a 17-year-old girl looked into the blue eyes of a 23-year-old deputy marshal and felt her heart recognize its home. They lived many more years on their ranch, seeing their children's children grow and even meeting a few great-grandchildren before age finally began to slow them down. Xavier passed away peacefully in 1928 at the age of 73, with Danielle holding his hand and his family gathered around him. His last words were "Thank you for being worth the wait," and Danielle knew he meant not just the months he had waited when she was 17, but their entire life together. Danielle lived another 5 years, surrounded by the family she and Xavier had created. She spent her days reading in the library that bore her name, visiting with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and writing down the story of her life with Xavier so that future generations would know about the cowboy marshal who had saved a scared girl behind a water trough, and then loved her with patience and devotion for more than 50 years. When she passed away in 1933 at the age of 73, the city of Fort Bridger held a memorial service that drew people from all over Wyoming. They spoke of her contributions to literacy and education, of her kindness and generosity, of the way she had helped build the community into what it was. But mostly they spoke of the love story between Danielle and Xavier Young, a story that had become legendary in Fort Bridger, a testament to patience, respect, and enduring love. They were buried side by side in the Fort Bridger Cemetery, under a large cottonwood tree not unlike the one where Xavier had proposed all those years ago. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names, dates, and a single inscription that Samuel had chosen. He waited until she was ready, and then they lived happily ever after. And they had. Through all the challenges of frontier life, through the transformation of the Wild West into modern civilization, through raising children and building careers and growing old together, they had lived happily. Not perfectly, but happily, because they had built their love on a foundation of mutual respect, patience, and the willingness to wait for the right time. Their children told their stories to their children, who told them to their children in turn. The tale of how Deputy Marshal Xavier Young saved young Danielle Lawson from both outlaws and her own youthful impulsiveness. How he loved her enough to wait until she was truly ready. How they built a life and a family that touched countless others, became part of Fort Bridger's history. The library Danielle founded still stands, now a much larger building but still serving the same purpose of bringing knowledge and stories to the community. Inside, there is a reading room named in honor of Xavier and Danielle Young, with their photograph hanging on the wall. In it, they are perhaps 40 years old, standing together in front of their ranch house. Xavier's arm is around Danielle's waist, and she is leaning into him, and they are both smiling with the contentment of people who have found exactly where they belong. Visitors to the library sometimes pause at that photograph, drawn by something in the couple's faces, some quality of love and happiness that transcends the old-fashioned sepia tones. They read the small plaque beneath that tells the story. How a young woman arrived in Fort Bridger in 1878, how she was saved by a deputy marshal, how she fell in love with him but he believed she was too young, how he promised to wait for her, and how that promise became a love story that lasted more than 50 years. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blows through the cottonwood trees that line Fort Bridger's streets, older residents swear they can still feel the presence of Xavier and Danielle Young, the marshal and his beloved, still watching over the town they helped build, still together as they always were. Their love story a reminder that the best things in life are worth waiting for, and that true love, given the right foundation, can last forever.